Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session here at the VAD Academy. For this time, we're going to be talking about land banks. I know that different conversations have come up throughout the day about the different approaches to dealing with VAD properties. And we've spoken a little bit about land banking activities in some of the sessions. For this one right here, we want to really dig into understanding what land banks are, how they work, and where they could be most effective. So let's go ahead and get started with our conversation for today. I'm Brian Larkin, and I'm the director of the National Land Bank Network here at the Center for Community Progress. Been in this role since January of last year and helping to serve the over 250 land banks across the country. I'm really excited about the place that the field is in right now and the opportunities. As we're seeing national conversations continue throughout, land banks are emerging as an amazing tool in the toolkit for our local communities to help deal with some of our most stubborn and troubling properties. I look forward to engaging with all of you through the session today. Please feel free to use the comment section throughout as we'll be browsing. If you have questions, feedbacks, or thoughts, please provide those in there throughout the time that we have here together. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So just a refresher on many things that you've heard so far, for those of you who have been able to attend all of the sessions, and for those of you who may just be chiming in right now, the persistent issue that we're looking to address in every session today is systemic vacancy. Systemic vacancy is not just one-off occurrence. It's understanding how these vibrant neighborhoods get trapped into this system where you have this negative feedback loop from your equity challenges, the impact triggers that inform the market and how to value the places that push people out and push investment out of our communities that then feeds right back into these equity challenges. This community-wide experience is one that has to be disrupted. As we've heard in many of our sessions, there's so many tools that communities have, but figuring out where's the right place to start can be challenging. So land banking is one of those such tools that works in a particular environment. Land banks are public authorities that are focused on the conversion of vacant, abandoned, and tax-delinquent properties. I want to pause right there because I think it's really, really important to understand what land banks are. The fact that they're public has to do with the pipeline of properties. Where is this land coming from? The properties in which they are best equipped to serve are these VAD properties that we've discussed today. And the end use, that productivity, is something that is so very, very important in our communities that land banks can be uniquely positioned to address. Even more important than what land banks are, though, is what land banks are not. So for those of you who are joining and haven't heard earlier, all of our presentations will be sent out following later on in the weeks and in the coming days following the sessions. Presentations will be out. The recordings are available for all of our sessions. But this slide right here, if you want to take notes, this is the only slide I recommend you take notes on now. I want you to emblazon this in your memory. And I'm being a little funny, but in all seriousness, land banks are not CDCs. Can they do some of the functions of community development corporations? Absolutely. Are there examples of amazing land banks across the country who are doing development work? Definitely. Is that the core function of a land bank? No. Land banks are not financial institutions. I know it sounds funny, but there are some of you who are coming from states that don't have any land banks at all. My first land banking experience was working at the front desk of a countywide land bank. I had an individual come into my office, come into the front desk, and this was around 2006, and say, "Hey, I'm looking to cash my check." Now, I say that not as a joke to make fun of the individual, but to recognize that land banks aren't always widely understood in what they are and are not. Also, land banks aren't the way for get-rich-quick schemes. As we watch television in this day and age, house flipping and all of these different opportunities about, man, where the private market can make a bundle, buy low and sell high and get in and get out quick. The inventory that we're dealing with land banks is not for that purpose. And the larger needs of our community, which I'll address later, how are they further enhanced with some of these get rich quick ideas? And the last piece in this picture to the side, land banks are not Rumpelstiltskin. And what do I mean by that? For those of you who know the fable, knows that Rumpelstiltskin did the impossible, turned it into gold overnight, and all he needed in return was your firstborn child. Land banks cannot take the dilapidated, the unwanted, with no resources. You go to sleep and we turn it into millions of dollars of resources only in exchange for your firstborn child. That's not going to be possible. And there's so many people who are with misconceptions about land banks. And they were saying, oh, well, how can you do this? Or how can I do this quick thing and turn this quick around? They're looking at long, systemic challenges to our communities. And they are an amazing tool. But we have to use it in context. And we have to understand where they work great and where the challenges are. So land banks. The first word in land banks is land. Where does that land come from? So the primary pipeline for land banks across the country is the tax foreclosure system. A recent survey done of land banks throughout the country showed that over 70% of the property in their inventory at that point in time came from the tax foreclosure pipeline. This is really important. This is the lifeline of land banking activities. So when we look at the different ways in which this process works, starts with private ownership, and we've talked about this before. When individuals decide that I no longer can extract the value that makes sense for me to be a private owner, as we heard from Alan Malik in the opening section, if some of you are able to see, enters into the tax foreclosure system, then that's when you're looking into public ownership. The purpose of land banks is to intervene. If you think about that cycle that I showed at the front end, is to intervene to extract these tax foreclosed properties that people have abandoned and left away quickly, to quickly get them, pull them out of that system, figuring out where they could go, and then pull them out of that system, and then figure out ways to make these properties more accessible for a productive use. Some of the challenges to properties being accessible are unclear title, property liens, needs for maintenance and repair, parcels that are incongruent with future development goals, the taxes on holding a property for development. Land banks can uniquely be positioned through various communities to intervene into this process, to take these tax foreclosed properties and move them through the system. One thing I'll say right now, the first question to think about when you're in a community that does not have a land bank and is interested in a land bank addressing your community goals is, what pipeline do you have for your land bank? Looking at this slide right here, are there tax foreclosed properties that are sitting underutilized in your community? Are there properties in private ownership that public dollars are regularly going into and not recouping the costs, that if the full cost was bared, the private market would walk away from? Those properties are the pipelines for land banks. That is where we think of properties that will sit for a long time and further spread some of the negative impacts of that. That is where land banks come in to quickly come in and revitalize and flip, moving that forward. So we told you where the properties come from, but what can they do? Well, this is where land banking gets its superpowers from. Land banks are able to acquire the property cost effectively. Lowering that acquisition cost is the name of the game in providing some of these end goal outcomes that are so important in our communities. Also, land banks have the ability to extinguish liens and clear titles. They can hold the property tax exempt. They can generate and collect revenue from delinquent tax fees, tax recapture, or other funding mechanisms. And land banks are not just a redevelopment authority or just a real estate arm because they operate with a higher mission in mind. The majority of land banks, and our most successful and effective ones, engage in disposition strategies where they're giving property, selling property, transferring properties based on community goals, not just based on the highest transaction. So again, when you think about some of the things I stated earlier, we're dealing with some of the toughest properties that are falling through the cracks, serving as a safety net. And we're also returning them in ways that benefit the community as a whole, not necessarily maximizing as highest transaction costs. And ultimately, they're accountable to the public, given their status as governmental entities. This right here is what the land bank's toolbox consists of to accomplish those larger goals that we said before. So if you're thinking about your community, do you have that pipeline of properties? If you had some of these tools on this slide right here, could you unlock that pipeline of properties? Then land banking may make sense for your community. So where do these powers come from? Land banking powers come from your state legislation. And it is so, so important to recognize that land banking is only as powerful as the tools that are given to you from your state enabling legislation. The map here needs to be updated. There are 2 additional states. We have Kentucky and I believe Delaware. Some of my colleagues can chime in the chat if I mistaken. I know Kentucky is one of them, but we now have 17 states in the country that have passed enabling legislation that allows for land banks to engage in work in their community, in their state. Each of these states are different in what their statewide legislation looks like. And different to the statewide enabling legislation, we also have some municipal authorities that have legislation. So in Illinois, for instance, there's the ability land banking occurs in the state of Illinois outside of a statewide legislation. In the state of Texas, we have land banking as an activity going on based on the select municipalities that were identified. So land banking occurs throughout, but you need some sort of enabling legislation. And from our vantage point, the most effective enabling legislation is that which can occur statewide. That way, as market conditions change and as different communities are moving forth and down, the local communities can then authorize land banking in a way that makes the most sense. Again, this is where your powers come from. This is what enables you to engage in land banking activities. And if you're thinking about that pipeline you have of tax foreclosed properties and the fact that you would love to be able to capture that in a cost-effective way, but your state doesn't have enabling legislation, then engage with the Center for Community Progress through our National Technical Assistance, our National Land Bank Network Act. There are different ways in which we've supported communities, and of the states that have enabling legislation, all have received some sort of support and interaction from the Center for Community Progress, whether it's outright helping them draft the legislation from beginning and ushering it through the process, engaging with local leaders, supporting those who are doing the drafting, or sharing some of our information on how it best can be created. Identifying what enabling legislation exists in your state is the first place to start when identifying whether or not you can do land banking right now and what powers your land bank may have. So when looking at the field of land banks, land banking as a phenomenon, as a current phenomenon, dates back to the response to the mortgage foreclosure crisis. Land banking as an activity in our country dates back much further than that. We've had land banking activities in the mid-90s, 80s, and 70s as well, where public entities, your city or your county, decided to establish a program in which they would bank their city-owned land. This is where their property exists. What we saw in the 2000s was that the amount of VAD properties, people just walking away, and foreclosures was going up at a much greater rate than anybody could have ever really imagined. So as a result, figuring out ways to utilize the tax foreclosure system to provide a reasonable pipeline for land banking occurred. We saw the first generations of these land banks start off, and then it just boomed from there. For where we had a handful of land banks in the early 2000s, there are over 250 land banks currently nationwide. As I mentioned, 17 states have comprehensive enabling legislation, and these land banks are doing powerful, powerful work. whether it's leveraging federal dollars for demolition activities, supporting public art and placemaking works, or in general, getting VAD properties into reproductive use. Land banking activities have shown massive success throughout the country. And again, the majority of these properties that they're working with come from our tax foreclosed pipeline. So what do land banks do? Once you've received this property that's in your system, using the powers that you have, so what? Well, we recognize that land banks are varied depending on what your community needs are. But listed here are some of the activities that land banks engage in throughout the country. One thing that we've seen throughout all land banks, the base level, you have to maintain the properties that you have. Any land bank that's engaged in acquiring property, that has any property in the inventory, has some strategy for how they're going to maintain the property in which they have. But how do you grow from there? We've seen land banks throughout the country support vacant lot reuse strategies. When looking at vacant land, vacant lots specifically, so we're looking at our structure-free lots. Structure-free lots make up 87% of the inventory that's currently in land banks. So when you're thinking about the potential that land banks have, and we're only limited to existing structures and rehabilitation development, we are missing out the great opportunity for the majority of the portfolio. And of this 87%, the majority are not ready right now to be developed on. So what type of vacant lot reuse strategies occur? Those can be identified through our online resource center here at the Center for Community Progress, or looking at some amazing examples of what land banks are doing throughout the country. Whether you're looking for things that are supporting climate resilience, like stormwater retention, whether you're looking for arts and placemaking, community gathering spaces, small local book libraries. I mean, these vacant spaces exist within communities. Activating these spaces is more than just the impact that you have on the land. It is activating our larger community, which then makes it easier to support some of our larger community goals. So vacant lot reuse as an activity is a major function of land banks across the country. In addition, job creation. Land banks, when they're supporting their local community, are able to look in the different aspects across the development process, whether it's demolition of structures, abatement, maintenance of lots, development of lots, rehabilitation. There are many activities in which the land bank is stimulating its local economy by supporting different activities. They are the best examples are when we see land banks that are intentional about having job creation activities for the communities that they represent. Land banking as an activity is one that you may have a specific district that's on a county or a region or even a multi-region area. But when you boil it down, there's oftentimes target communities and municipalities that are most directly affected by these VAD properties, and having any opportunity to create economic opportunities to support the individuals that are in there further helps to disrupt that cycle of systemic vacancy. In addition to job creation, we're seeing some communities working in foreclosure prevention activities. Again, when we're thinking about that pipeline, as that pipeline of tax foreclosed properties begins to grow and grow and grow, while yes, we would love to have the opportunity to turn those into great future productive use for our communities, we also look at what are ways that we can prevent these properties from occurring like this in general. Your land banks and your county trustees or treasurers, your foreclosing agent in your community, land banks and the foreclosing agency have a great compatible relationship in their existence. So it works really well when they're working closely together. Some great examples we've seen of land banks helping to go work up the pipeline of the properties to connect them to with foreclosure prevention activities that are through local agencies, community development agencies, nonprofits, also your municipalities, and some of this work occurs in land banks itself. And then last but not least, development. What can we build here? What can we fix here? What can we change here? Of the land banks that responded to our national survey, the majority of which were really interested in learning how to expand into the development space. As it stands right now, the majority are doing something in the maintenance space and figuring out ways to do vacant lot reuse and even acquiring and disposing of. But how they get more robustly into this development space, rehabilitation, and new construction for the sake of community goals, such as affordable housing, is where the future of land banking lies. So, what type of land banks exist? If we look at the graph here, land banks cover various different types of agencies, various different types of sizes, but here are some of the trends and what we're seeing in the field of land banks. If you look on the left, more than half of land banks in the country represent counties, and then about a third are municipal based. Again, they're usually aligned with that foreclosing governmental unit. If you're in a community where the foreclosing agent is at the city level, then it makes sense for your land bank to occur at the city level. If you're working at the county level, then at the county. When you see our multi-municipal and regional examples, those particularly align when you're looking at what makes the most sense for the partners and resources. Some of those are when you're covering larger rural areas, and of the sake, land banks should be established in a way that makes the most sense to your community and aligns with your state enabling legislation. Where they occur, if you look at the graph on the right here, the question was asked in land banks, where are the majority of your properties located? So when we're looking at the inventory, and that goes to the previous statement I made, while you may be a countywide or regional land bank, if the majority of your properties are in urban areas, rural or suburban, it's good to know that, because as we're crafting our interventions and trying to identify support, we need to figure out the ways in which to accomplish these goals here. As you can see, roughly 2/3 of the properties are located, 2/3 of the land banks indicate that the majority of their properties are in urban areas, but also a really significant portion, over 26% of properties in the inventory and land banks come from majority rural areas. This is really helping to inform a lot of the work at the National Land Bank Network as we're trying to identify ways to speak on behalf of the field and help when we identify future supports for communities and future supports for land banks and the work that they're able to do. So what are some of the characteristics of land banks as they occur today? Land banks, more than half, and so we can say the majority, don't have adequate enough funding to cover basic expenses. When you look at those 17 states that we laid out earlier, only one state provides recurring dollars for their land bank that they can rely on an annual basis from a statewide resource. There are other examples that identify local sources, but again, going back to my earlier slide on what they're not, land banks aren't Rumpelstiltskin, and they aren't provided with this standardized, reliable source of resources. And we're trying to get to work with some of our most challenging properties, and we don't want to send them into just the highest dollar transaction. As you're understanding these pieces, these are conversations that the National Land Bank Network is excited to engage in and take to some of our policymakers and national partners, because what we're looking at here are the need for community investments in land banks so they can drive our communities forwards. When we look at land banks as organizations, we're not thinking about behemoth, large bureaucratic entities. In fact, half of the land banks surveyed only had one full-time equivalent or less. Most of them are small organizations. And so one of the benefits when thinking about approaching land banks and engaging in that work is how can you support and make it easier to engage in this work? At the same time, when you're thinking about your communities, for those who are on the call who don't have land bankings, how will your land banks be financed? How will they be staffed? Will this be a requirement of an existing personnel who's now carrying multiple hats? And if so, what limitations does that put on what land banking can do in your community? And many of these land banks are ready to do more. As I mentioned on the previous slide, all are engaged in some basic form of activities, but that full list, many land banks would like to engage in more of those activities based on what community needs are in place. And the potential exists to do that with larger supports. So when we're looking at what land banks have in their property, the median inventory of land banks is 40 properties, while the average is around 1,800. And that's representative of some large outliers. And also, I mentioned before, With our state enabling legislation, each state gets property differently. If you're in a state that has a process that sends all of the tax foreclosed property directly your way, your inventory would be a lot higher on the end. When we're looking at these nimble and small and flexible organizations that are identifying the properties and bringing them, putting in, we're looking at organizations with 40 properties or less. Also, as I mentioned before, 87% of these are vacant lots. So when we're looking at what our strategies can be, vacant lot reuse is the name of the game and where the potential lies for growth. There's a great understanding in our communities where it looks at what are our needs, what are our housing needs, what are our commercial needs, what are our structure needs. But that vacant lot reuse is a really underexplored subject and area, and one that can have immediate impact and immediate influence in our communities. So, as I mentioned earlier, land banks are mission-based organizations. They operate in non-traditional real estate roles. The vast majority of land banks stated that they're selling their properties for less than fair market value, and they're prioritizing residents as their number one recipient of properties. When asked who are they most likely to provide properties to when they're doing property transfers, community residents, local nonprofits, local LLCs, and some private entities. What you don't see up here, out of city, out of region, out of state investors, out of state private entities. They're not necessarily looking for the highest cash sale. And this is so very, very important because that transaction, while in the short term may provide a larger monetary windfall, the long term feeds right back into that systemic vacancy challenge. And when we look at the systemic vacancy challenge, it is not one that is randomized. It is not one that just happens, perhaps. It's not based on specific housing types or others. In Alan Malik's presentation earlier today, he showed examples with identical housing structures in different markets. And we recognize that these housing markets are not indifferent to the people that reside inside of them. And so when we're looking at the work of Land Bank, we are working to address systemic inequities that are embedded within our housing system, that are embedded in our real estate markets, and help provide some of these persistent VAT issues that we're seeing throughout. This map here is from Albany County, New York, and I like to use it it kind of helps bring home the image and you can visualize. One, the Albany County Land Bank is doing some amazing work in New York. I'm not sure if Adam or his staff are in the chat here, but doing some outstanding things here. And this slide here shows when you look at the history of inequitable housing strategies. So when we're talking about redlining, when we're looking at areas in which home values were unnaturally suppressed, where financial institutions were barred from engaging, that suppressed the growth that could occur over the years, which then encouraged people to get into that cycle, to bounce out, to use vacancy, to move to other places, lack of investment coming in. And now you have these pockets that then, as we fast forward a generation later, that's where our land bank inventories are. So when we're looking at how we're working to address this inventory, we can't just look at the transaction level, because it wasn't just an individual transaction that led to that. It was a large aligning of policies, practices, and community values that helped depress these values, which in turn led to this current challenge that our entire community is experiencing. While we recognize that the individuals who reside in these homes, the individuals who live in these communities, and the individuals who are not allowed to purchase homes in these other areas were directly impacted, everyone feels the effects of inequities like this at this scale. Your entire communities are bearing the weight of the costs that are associated with public safety on these challenging properties, that are dealing with maintenance issues, boarding of dangerous structures, any health challenges and outcomes. Our entire communities are dealing with these challenges. And so land banking, as they're looking towards our disposition strategies, the most effective land banks are recognizing their history, recognizing their current conditions and devising strategies that will help uplift and support a new cycle where the value of properties is able to be actualized by the people who are there, and they're able to spread that value that enhance the nearby community, that lifts up and revitalizes the place, that then makes it a more easier place to live and a higher quality of life for everyone throughout, most directly those who are in the community, but everyone throughout the space. So again, when we asked in the question, one of the key questions we identified from land banks was, how closely does your staff and your board reflect the communities in which you represent? And so land bank leaders across the board mentioned they were increasingly interested in deepening their commitment to racial equity. The reason this is important is because of what we mentioned before, understanding the impacts that land has on equity. Equity has such a close tie, racial issues. In addition, we're also seeing very class and deep historic issues that if land banks are educated on and aware of, the strategies and how they engage with the community will be more beneficial. And the most effective land banks are those that have close ties with their neighboring communities, recognizing that this work can't get done in a vacuum, that the land banks are not doing all of this alone by themselves, and that the most effective land banks recognize that while they're an organization and they have individuals who work there, the tools and the power of the land bank belong to the community. So as we mentioned earlier, the special tools are acquiring property tax, helping in the acquisition process of getting property out of that tax foreclosed pipeline. Anybody who's engaged in dealing with those sorts of property and resides in a community that has a land bank has access to this tool. How do you partner with your land bank if you're a community development corporation? If you're your local nonprofit or a national or a branch of Habitat for Humanity, and you have a land bank that's there and active and understands the cost, engaging in that conversation to understand what impact does that have on the development of affordable housing in communities that couldn't receive it? Are those dollars able to be transferred down and sent back to residents? Is that able to reflect in value and greater value? Your community needs and goals, if the land bank's tools can help accomplish that, then your organization, your community, you as a resident have those tools and powers. Engage with your land bank, engage in conversations and understanding how we can get these properties so we can get these larger goals, get them through the process in a way that makes sense, and how we can utilize the tools that they have. The better you understand how your land bank functions, the better you can recognize how those tools can be utilized, and the more partners a land bank can have. Land banks can be amazingly powerful tools, but the most powerful tool that they have is the tool of partnership. So as we mentioned, the field of land bank is beginning to grow and growing over the last decade and a half. One of the things we're really excited about is the role that networking can begin to engage in supporting our land banks. As I get through, just a few slides left, and then we're going to begin in Q&A. If you're having questions or things come up, please feel free to drop those in the comments here. See, some of my colleagues are in there to give you some direct responses, and some of those that we have saved up, we're going to go through the Q&A, and I'm going to do direct questions and answers. Going to provide a little extended period of time for the Q&A portion here. So if you're sitting on your question or your comment, go ahead and put that in there now. So as it pertains to the National Land Bank Network, we explained to you in the conversation what land banks are, what they're not, how they work, where they get their tools, but what's next? We recognize that the field of land banking is so very, very new. One of my favorite questions to ask to any group of land bank professionals or people in general is, how many people, when they were in grade school thinking about what they wanted to become, raised their hand and say, I want to work at a land bank? You'll see very, very few. And I'll say I've asked that question in all types of rooms, and I have yet to see anyone ever raise their hand. And why is that? Because this field is so new. We're talking about since 2008, 80% of these land banks have begun. So as a result, we are building a professional network that is learning as it's going, that is identifying best practices to share across, but also learning from each other, learning from those who are ahead and behind. And so the National Land Bank Network is stepping in to serve in that role to facilitate this work, to connect partners, help land banks connect with partners and community members to determine what their needs are and to provide support, to help them increase their capacity, and to help advocate for increased funding and resources. That advocacy piece is vital, is really vital and important. Here at the Center for Community Progress, we have a policy and research team that's led up by our director, who is able to stay on top of these federal issues. Land banks are small organizations, hyper-focused on their local community and staying on the ground. We are trying to support them in raising the national profile of these conversations, identifying what sort of existing resources are available, what as new resources are coming online, helping policymakers and partners understand why land banking is an important use of that, how land banking can help accomplish some of these goals, and encouraging individuals to identify resources for land banks. If land banks can't turn straw into gold, then how are they going to generate revenues? What we need to understand is there needs to be local investment and buy-in. There needs to be public investment and buy-in. There's conversations occurring at the local levels. There's conversations occurring at our state levels. And we want to support those at the federal level as well. We're engaging in these conversations to say, what are the policies that look to support these activities? If you're a community that wants that end result of families able to stay in their homes, able to repopulate our communities, able to support them, and you think land banks are a great tool to reduce that acquisition cost, then how do we invest? How do we identify resources so that land banks have the capacity to understand where they can best be suited to support our community and to be proactive in supporting with partners and supporting throughout? The most amazing land banks throughout the country are able to be proactive. They're able to look forward and see opportunities. They're able to bring partners together and convene. They're able to set the table, and all community partners are able to be present and come together to think about these larger community goals to help our residents reimagine their communities, the communities that they reside and love in, the communities that they love to raise our families, to work and play, and moving forward. So the National Land Bank Network is really excited about our role of advocating for land banks, but also connecting to them. If successful, this is what we view land banks will be able to state that they are. If our National Land Bank Network is successful in how we support our land banks, we can say without a shadow of a doubt that land banks are connected. Through our monthly convenings, newsletters, our national conferences, different trainings, we're wanting to create this field of cohort of individuals. I enjoy that when I get in here and look in the chat, I'm able to see familiar names, individuals who are engaging throughout. The answers for how we're going to figure this out don't solely exist at the Center for Community Progress. While we have some amazing experts in field, and I may be biased, but we have the creme de la creme when it comes to subject matter experts as it pertains to land banks. But there's only so much that they can do as individuals. Our National Technical Assistance Team is outstanding. And if anyone is a land bank in here and has not yet engaged with our National Technical Assistance Team, our director, Tariq Abdelazim, is in the chat there. And please feel free to chime a message with them. But we're mortals. There's only so many of us here. And the more that we can able to create these connections, create these interactions where land banks in Ohio are having conversations with land banks in Pennsylvania, leaders in Chicago, talking to leaders in Memphis and Georgia, and understanding, oh, you've done that before. How are they working? How are those things happening? And so later in this summer, we're looking to roll out our initial platform, a web-based platform that will host the place for all land banks to interact, to pose questions and inquiries, to have a resource library, to share information, to have a current events calendar, and just kind of connect each other throughout. When land banks are connected, they're better able to solve their own problems. In addition, we want to make sure that land banks are prepared. There is so much data and information out there, but it's challenging. When half of the land banks throughout the country only have one full-time equivalent staff, it's kind of an unrealistic expectation to say, hey, get all this information to make the best decision on which properties we should acquire, what type of return we can get for it, and where we should be disposing of properties. But that's what is expected of land banks. The National Land Bank Network would like to support the land banks. So as members that become members of the network, one of the things that we want to provide for them is data. We're doing snapshots of their communities to understand, hey, here are some of the trends. Here's what we're seeing and what's going on. And here's what could happen if you acquire properties in these areas. Here's what some of your larger impacts could be. Rehabilitating properties, demolishing structures. This is the greater impact that it would have. Beyond just the investment in the structure, what impact would it have on surrounding property values? What impact does it have on raising overall community goals? What we want to do is prepare land bank leaders so they can enter in conversations with their boards and prepare their boards as well. So you can have those conversations about how can this amazing tool that we have be used as efficiently as possible to help go in there and support, and ultimately resourced. We are never stopping in our constant quest to ring the bell about the great work that land banks are doing, the amazing tool that they are, and the need to support them, the need to support and finance them. When you understand the challenge that land banks are addressing, we understand then the need there is to address them in an equitable fashion. And the only way we can do that is when they become resourced with the appropriate needs and finances. So that concludes my presentation here. At this point in time, I will go and start going through the Q&A chat. Please feel free to still chime in. You see the screen here? This is the best information to date about land banks. If you've heard some interesting things here and would like to know more and understand where they've come from, please stop by our site, communityprogress.org, and in our publication space, you will find all of this information here. The first two specifically Community Progress publications, but also there are links available if they're not there, and then some can be accessed as well about some land banking activities. So I'll start at the top. And the first one that I see that came across here, and some of these questions, they may have been answered already, so I'll kind of go quickly. So we have one that said, are tax foreclosed properties the primary pipeline for community land trusts as well? Not necessarily. And I will never claim to be the foremost expert on community land trusts. But when you're looking at that tax foreclosed pipeline, land banks have a specific tool that allows them to get them at an affordable way. Community land trusts, while they're focused in permanent affordability moving forward, they're not given any specific tools that would make tax foreclosed properties more advantageous than any other property. Which doesn't mean that you can't show a land trust that has that pipeline, or you don't have land trusts that are working really closely with land banks in that space. But land trusts in and of themselves aren't given those specific tools. Yes. And so, Karen, to this question about whether the state has to allow. So state enabling legislation is the ideal way in which land banks occur. The legislation then says who can authorize land banks. Is it at your county level? Is it at your municipal? However, as I mentioned, there are examples of where local jurisdictions have used a form of home rule to establish land banking activities. The state of Illinois has some robust land bank activity that occurs based on its local level. It's not a statewide enabling legislation. But for a best practice and what we generally like to encourage, yes, that the state passes enabling legislation and then the local jurisdictions are then able to follow that legislation, because then it makes it very clear what powers you have, what that process is, and how you can move forward with that. So the next one, how are land banks different from urban renewal authorities? So the historic urban renewal perspective, I think when you mention urban renewal, and I myself am an urban planner by trade, when you mention urban renewal, it sends a lot of thoughts and ideas to individuals, and for just causes. I think we've seen a lot of challenging things occur as a result to urban renewal. We saw a lot of displacement and other pieces. One thing that land banks do not have, and I'm glad you asked this question, I want to be very clear, none of the legislation that the Center for Community Progress has supported and none of the kind of promotion ideas we say will ever allow or encourage land banks to have the ability for eminent domain. We're not talking about taking of properties or relocation or relocating individuals. Also, the distinction of urban renewal authorities is there isn't the resources. There aren't resources to come in and do these large public works programs. So it is not, land banks are not sitting resource with these resources to say, okay, you have to go and build XYZ amount of units throughout the place. So go and do it wherever you can and clear out and make this future community. They are small organizations that are saying, we have a challenge here. We have these properties that people are walking away from and they're sitting too long and it's hard to get our hands onto them. Can you help us get our hands onto them so that we can quickly dispose of them, so we can transfer them, so we can get them into these larger goals? They're about these individual pieces, these linkages and these connections. They are not a larger kind of mandated strategy of this is what the future of this place looks like, and the land bank is going to go forth and execute that. So the next one we have here, our biggest barrier to reactivating bad properties is untangling titles of heirs properties. Super expensive and complicated in Georgia specifically. Need cheat codes to expedite that particular issue. A land bank has access to a law clinic, but it can't make the process faster. Any policies we should support, advocate for with Georgia legislation. And so, Anna, I will be happily connect you with our Georgia partners. So we have a leader of our Georgia technical assistance work, Odetta, and also we have Sarah, our senior fellow, who work really closely with this work. And this is one of the emerging issues that we're looking at right now, specifically dealing with that. One of the challenges in talking about land banking in this space is, how did the heirs property get into the land bank inventory? Most of the time when we're having those conversations, it hasn't in some of those pieces. One of the roles in which, and what I mean is the larger heirs property challenges are still in the ownership of the individuals. It's not a foreclosed property that's already moved on into a land bank inventory. And so then that limits sometimes the role in which land banks play in this specific issue. However, as I mentioned on the previous slide, some land banks are looking to go up that streamline and go into the foreclosure prevention, partnering, and engaging. The biggest tool that they have in that place is the ability to bring partners together and to convene and understanding that piece. So the conversation with heirs property specifically in Georgia is one that's really emerging, and we're trying to identify ways. As we're thinking about land banks, primarily looking at that tax foreclosed pipeline that ends up in land bank inventory. For the most cases, we would hope that those interventions occur on the front end before you get foreclosed, because at that point, you've kind of extracted all of that wealth from heirs in that space. They no longer own the property. They no longer have that place. And we don't really want it to get to that when you're talking about heirs properties issues. So I think working in places to understand that, but we definitely have some experts within our organization who are working through this topic now, specifically in Georgia. So I urge you to connect with them in that space. So the next one, how can you ensure private interests do not dominate land banks? So it has to do with a lot of pieces. So we mentioned land banks are public entities. So they're accountable to the public. In some examples, land banks have advisory committees where you have residents who sit in and are able to understand and work with. There's a visible board of directors of your land bank. So how you're engaging and understanding what their priorities are. But what I can kind of beating a drum over and over here, the land banks that are most effective at upholding community interests are those that have flexible and diverse revenue sources. So the reason private interests can begin to hold an outsourced role in decision-making is because of the limited resources to accomplish the goal. And we don't want land banks to be in that position, having to try to keep the lights on. So then we're going to do this other transaction when it doesn't really align to communities. I think having a voice within the land bank, whether it's through advisory committees, it's through partnerships, whether it's through board representation, that's an amazing way to codify it, to make sure that there will always be this bit of partnership. But then also in the program design, when we're looking at programs that look at communities who are stewarding vacant land, when you look at adopt a lot process, when you look at side lot transfers, all of these different places provide opportunities for the public to partner really closely with land banks. But again, I think land banks are as flexible as they are based on their resources, understanding their opportunities, and being connected with the community. So one more. Thank you. Are there any benefits or trade-offs to having a land bank versus doing this work through the city's housing agency? And I think the answer to this question goes back to the slide about land bank powers. And I think it is right here. So the question is, are there any benefits to doing it through a land bank? The benefits of doing this work through a land bank is if these powers that you see listed on the screen, one, if a land bank in your community would have these powers, some or all of these powers, and two, does your city housing agency have these powers? If no, so if the first answer is yes, if we did a land bank here has these powers, or if we started one, it would have these powers. No, our city housing agency does not have these powers. And three, and most importantly, will these powers help accomplish our community goals? Do we have that pipeline of tax foreclosed properties that we're going to use these powers on to then accomplish these community goals? If your answers align for those pieces, then land banking makes the most sense in that space. And so the trade-off in that piece, it's not a better than or worse than. It's not land banks are a really particular and finite tool that can be used specifically in that space. And so I think that's where you see the best bang for your buck with land banking. So the next question, are the federal guidelines or groups that oversee how states and local municipalities execute their land bank practices? Now, this one, I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with. And so I would encourage if any individuals in the chat familiar there from the National Land Bank Network perspective right now, there aren't any federal guidelines. No, because if you go back to the slide before, if we see when I mentioned where do the land bank powers come from? States. One of the things we don't see a lot of is state enabling legislation that then has a kind of the specific underwrite. So because land banking isn't federally mandated or overseen with any kind of federal structure or oversight, we don't see that right now. But they're best practices. Absolutely. And that's the role the National Land Bank Network is stepping in, helping to support. There's some existing federal legislation that has been formally introduced and may be looking to be reintroduced again, a National Land Bank Network Act, which looks to support land banks. And through, once you identify resources, when you think about kind of where a lot of the federal regulations come from, it comes from their resources. So if you're spending federal dollars, here are the federal rules that you follow. So in order for us to get more federal guidelines, we need more federal resources. But again, from our perspective, we are not looking to approach a lot of these land bank conversations with the heavy stick of this is wrong and this is that. It's how can we support it? How can you do it better? Where are some opportunities? And what we've seen from most communities is that they're interested in understanding what are better and other ways to do this. So we've got a question from Detroit. And I'm going to go through this one. So there's a large land bank in Detroit, member of a square mile CDC in the city with 90 land bank properties owned within their boundaries owned by the city. Is there a need to form a land bank? Are there any models of large cities who have a large land bank have worked cooperatively with smaller ones in the city boundaries? So one thing we have not seen is, one thing I don't have as much familiarity with is land banks with overlapping boundaries. Now we have state land banks, specifically I know in the state of Michigan, where their purview are in the counties that don't have land banks. You usually have some pieces where there's a bit of an understanding. The reason this probably doesn't happen as much is because of the piece that I mentioned at the end. The land bank is an organization, but the powers of the land bank exist within the community. If you are in a community that is represented by a land bank, you have the ability to do these powers. These powers already are bestowed upon your community. So now, how does your specific, in this specific example, how does your CDC partner with the land bank to say, okay, because one of the challenges when we're thinking about land banks here, you have to administer the process of receiving property. And in the Michigan example, you have to receive all of the tax foreclosed property that the treasurer passes along that goes through the process at the end of that line. So instead of enacting another organization, if you're really interested in that end result and that end activity, how do you take the powers that already exist by the land bank, these powers to acquire the property, then align with the activities that you would like to engage in at that end goal? Whether your activities, if your CDC is interested in rehabilitation or development or new construction, or just if you want to go by and help maintain vacant lots and structures, figuring out what are the activities that you would like to really engage in. And I'll move the screen here. Figuring out what are the activities that you would like to engage in, and then formalizing some sort of partnership. There are examples of land banks that have MOUs with different organizations that says, hey, we're targeting this geographic area, and these are the resources that our organization has. Then we like to work there. Because again, when you're thinking about starting your own land bank, why do you want to start the land bank? Is it to get some resources? Is it because of the access to finances and those things? Because those don't exist. Right now, what you get when you have a land bank is ability to tap into this pipeline, get this tax foreclosed property for cheaper than you could normally acquire it, than anyone who didn't have a land bank. If you're working in a land bank in a community that has a land bank already, how can you then work on the tail end? You don't want to work back and have to duplicate the same efforts of acquiring the property and working with the treasurer. What you really want to do is activate those parcels. And that comes through partnership with your land bank. You're in a community that has those powers. You understand kind of how those powers are working. How then do you work forward with that? So I think I have time for one more question through the chat. And I apologize for not getting to all of them. But here we go. Our land bank is county-based, and they often look at our city specifically as a tear everything down part of the county. How do you suggest we change their minds and find alternatives to tear downs? So this is a really good question, and this is one that is pretty common. A little bit of background and kind of how we got here in space. Federal resources came through over the past, I would say, 5 to 7 years to really support demolition. What we saw was when we had that mortgage foreclosure crisis, people were just walking away from things. And the most challenging properties, people walked away from the quickest and got the worst. And with no safety net to capture this, communities were filled with all of these challenging structures. Federal resources came down in the millions and millions of dollars to help with demolition. Land banks were an ideal partner to help execute that demolition. So what happens when you have these federal resources? They are then aligning the activities that are occurring afterwards. And so many of these land banks that have grown over this past decade have grown under an environment where the most robust resources were there to support demolition activities. This is not a statement that says the values of the community or the values of the leaders at the land bank state that all they want to do is demolish. This states, here are the resources that they can adequately execute. The question is, how can we better understand ways to engage in some of these other activities that you see on the screen right here? How can we partner with our land banks to figure out what does it take to get towards that end result? If this is not something that you can do within or it doesn't pencil out, who are some of the local supporters that can engage in helping make this happen? Are there public resources? Are there philanthropic resources? Are there partners or examples in other communities? Here at the National Land Bank Network, we hope to raise and elevate some of those best practices and raise some of those strategies. And so with that being said, that's the conclusion of our conversation here. I want to thank you all for your conversation, for your questions and feedback and interest today. I apologize for not being able to get to every single one of them. Thank you for your time at VAD Academy. Now that we have a break scheduled, please enjoy your time to go into the speed networking or other areas throughout. Thank you guys and have a wonderful day.